So lads, today's game against the Wings was a bad one. A bad loss. Pissed at Stephanie White. I'm pissed at the referees. It was just a bad loss.
What if I told you that a single game could shatter fans' trust in the WNBA? That's exactly what happened when the Indiana Fever faced the Dallas Wings. A matchup that was already intense, but ended up exploding into one of the most controversial moments in recent memory. Late in the game, with everything on the line, the referees made a series of baffling decisions that had players, commentators, and fans scratching their heads.
Up there with the worst calls I think I've ever seen in basketball. You can just see right here, Sophie and Paige. Sophie has her arms out. Sophie doesn't have her arms on Paige, and Paige just shoves her. Paige just shoves her, and it's called as a foul on Sophie.
But the real shock didn't come until later, when secret game footage surfaced, appearing to show the officials blatantly favoring one side. This wasn't just a missed call. This was a sequence that felt so one-sided, so obvious, that people are asking if it was really just human error. Tonight, we're breaking down the plays, the footage, and why the league might be in full-blown panic mode trying to contain the fallout from this game.
One of the most egregious no-call or calls I've ever seen in basketball. Like, this is one of the ones where I'm like, I don't know what Aaliyah Boston's meant to do. So look here. So Aaliyah Boston currently has her right arm being put in a hold by Leah Rue. So Leah Rue, like, all I'm gonna say is that this is democracy manifest.
From the opening tip, the atmosphere inside the arena was electric. The Indiana Fever, fighting to keep their playoff hopes alive, were facing off against the Dallas Wings, a team equally hungry to make a statement. This wasn't just another regular season game. It was a battle where every possession mattered, and both teams knew it. The crowd felt it too. Every basket, every defensive stop, every whistle carried the weight of momentum. The Fever came. In knowing they'd need to play nearly perfect basketball, they were already facing scrutiny for inconsistent performances. And against a physical Dallas squad, the margin for error was razor thin.
To the point of the physicality, we even talked about it pregame. How disruptive maybe was that to both maybe the flow and what both teams were trying to do and find their rhythm out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a physical game. You know, I think there's a double standard in how people get their calls. I think Kelsey Mitchell, number one, is held or chucked on every freaking possession and never gets a call off the ball. I think Aaliyah Boston is the worst officiated post player in the league. She never gets a call. And you know, there's a double standard there, certainly.
Early on, the game had the intensity of a playoff matchup. Bodies crashed into each other in the paint. Perimeter shooters were tightly contested, and both teams were diving on the floor for loose balls. This was the kind of gritty, high-effort basketball that fans live for. Aaliyah Boston, the Fever's powerhouse in the paint, set the tone early. She battled fiercely for position, fighting through double teams and refusing to back down. Sophie Cunningham brought her trademark fire, constantly jawing with defenders and keeping the energy high. Kelsey Mitchell looked locked in, darting around screens and hitting big shots to keep the Fever within striking distance. But as the first half wore on, an unsettling pattern began to emerge. The officiating felt off. Whistles were blowing. On one end for contact that looked minimal, while on the other end, plays with even more contact were being let go entirely. The Wings were being given extra possessions through questionable foul calls, and each one chipped away at the Fever's rhythm.
And they went to the monitor, and they're literally like, this is an obvious offensive foul. Rebecca Lobo and Ryan Rocourt were just like, yeah, this is an obvious offensive foul. It's obviously an offensive foul. Like, it's fine. Like, they just made the assumption. They just made the assumption.
Still, Indiana stayed locked in. The tension was at its peak. The Fever had fought back from an early deficit, clawing their way to within just a few points. Every trip down the court mattered now. The crowd roared with each Fever basket, sensing a possible comeback. Dallas, however, was just as determined to slam the door shut, and the officiating was about to play a bigger role than anyone expected. Then came the stretch that would define the night. In the closing minutes, calls began to swing heavily in one direction. stopping Fever runs dead in their tracks and handing momentum back to the Wings. Players exchanged frustrated glances, began to boo loudly. You could feel it. This wasn't just competitive basketball anymore. This was something else entirely. And as the game hurtled toward its final moments, it became clear that the real story wasn't going to be about the score. It was going to be about the decisions made by the referees, decisions that would spark outrage, fuel conspiracy theories, and eventually lead to the release of secret footage that could change how people view the WNBA's credibility. It didn't take long for the first signs of trouble to appear. Even in the opening minutes, some of the calls left players and fans looking around in disbelief. The Fever came out aggressive, attacking the rim and drawing contact, but instead of hearing the whistle, they were met with silence. On the other end, the Wings seemed to benefit from the slightest touch being called in their favor. It wasn't just one or two moments, it was the kind of pattern that starts small and then snowballs into something you can't ignore. The first glaring example came when Kelsey Mitchell took a hard drive to the basket, clearly absorbing a forearm across the body from a Dallas defender. Fans rose from their seats, expecting free throws. Instead, the referees waved it off, letting play continue. Within seconds, Dallas was sprinting the other way, drawing a soft foul call on minimal contact. That whistle sent the Fever bench into a chorus of frustration, with players throwing their hands up, as if to say, "What are we supposed to do?" These weren't isolated moments of questionable judgment, they were moments that directly shifted momentum. In basketball, momentum is everything. A blown call doesn't just cost you points, it changes the pace, the energy, and the confidence. Of the players on the floor, the Fever were playing hard, but every time they started to find a rhythm, another strange whistle would cut it short. Then came the incident between Sophie Cunningham and Paige Buchanan. It was early enough in the game that you'd expect officials to set a fair tone, but what happened only deepened the suspicion. Paige launched a three-pointer and in the process kicked her leg outward, catching Sophie in a way that's often considered a dangerous, unnatural motion. Many in the arena, and those watching at home, thought it would draw an offensive foul. Instead, nothing was called. Minutes later, in an eerily similar scenario involving Grace Berger and Kelsey Mitchell, the whistle blew instantly against Indiana. The plays were nearly identical, yet the outcomes couldn't have been more different. At that point, frustration was boiling over. The Fever players began exchanging looks that said what they couldn't openly voice. Even commentators hinted at the imbalance, questioning why similar contact was being judged by entirely different standards. By the time the first half ended, the red flags were impossible to ignore. The Wings weren't just getting the benefit of the doubt, they were getting it on nearly every 50-50 call. And while some games have a few questionable moments, this one felt different. It felt intentional. The crowd knew it, the players knew it, and the stage was being set for something much bigger than just a game. Because while these early calls planted the seeds of doubt, what was coming in the final minutes would turn that doubt into full-blown outrage, and it would be caught on camera for the world to see. If there was a single matchup that symbolized the night's chaos, it was Sophie Cunningham going toe-to-toe with Paige Buchanan. These two aren't strangers to physical play, and both are known for pushing the line. But what happened between them in this game quickly became one of the most talked about sequences. The moment began with Paige setting up beyond the arc. Sophie closed in from the side, hands out, giving her just enough space to contest the shot without making contact. Paige rose up for the three, but midair she flung her leg out, catching Sophie in the side. It's the kind of kick-out move the league has been cracking down on for years, considering it both unsafe and a form of baiting the defense into a foul. In many games, that motion is called an offensive foul without hesitation. But here, nothing. No whistle. Play continued as if nothing had happened. For the Fever, it was frustrating enough to watch a dangerous play go unpunished. But the sting came just moments later when nearly the same scenario played out on the other end. Grace Berger set her feet on a perimeter shot, and Kelsey Mitchell landed awkwardly after minor contact with her defender. This time, the whistle blew instantly foul on Indiana. It was almost identical in movement to the Paige-Sophie play, yet the judgment couldn't have been more different. Fans inside the arena erupted, some booing, others waving their arms in disbelief. Social media lit up instantly with side-by-side replays, pointing out how one leg kick was ignored while another resulted in a foul. Commentators were careful with their words, but the skepticism was clear in their voices. They talked about consistency and player safety. Dancing around the obvious implication, the rules were not being applied evenly. What made it worse was Sophie's visible reaction. She turned to the official, gesturing to her side and mimicking the kick she'd just taken. You could see the incredulity on her face, as if she couldn't quite believe that the play had been overlooked. Meanwhile, Paige jogged back on defense without so much as a glance, a small smirk curling at the edge of her mouth. Moments like this don't just impact the scoreboard. They chip away at the competitive spirit of a game. The Fever had battled. Hard to stay close, but calls like these drained their momentum. Every player knows that officiating won't be perfect, but when the imbalance becomes this glaring, frustration starts bleeding into performance. Still, the Fever pressed on, to unravel completely, but the seeds of doubt had been planted, and every player on the court could feel it. The sense that they weren't just playing the wings, but also the people in stripes. And the most explosive moment of the night, the one that would ignite controversy far beyond this game, was still waiting in the wings. If the Sophie Paige leg kick incident had fans on edge, what happened next sent them over the brink. Early in the fourth quarter, with the game hanging in the balance, Paige Buchers and Sophie Cunningham got tangled up once again, only this time, the outcome defied all basketball logic. The sequence unfolded as Paige drove toward the wing, with Sophie sliding into position to cut her off. Sophie's arms were out wide, careful not to make contact. She was moving her feet, staying in front. Textbook defense. Then, in one quick motion, Paige extended both hands and shoved Sophie backwards. Sophie stumbled, but quickly regained her balance, expecting a whistle to blow for the offensive foul. After all, pushing an opponent with your hands is about as clear-cut a call as you can get. The whistle came, but to the shock of everyone in the arena, it wasn't on Paige. The referee signaled a foul on Sophie. For a split second, there was a stunned silence. Then, the crowd erupted in boos so loud they drowned out the announcer. Players on the Fever bench stood up, waving their arms in disbelief. Sophie herself turned to the official, pointing at Paige's hands, mouthing, "She pushed me." Replays showed exactly what everyone had seen in real time. Paige initiating contact with a full two-handed shove, while Sophie kept her arms out in a defensive stance. On slow motion, it was even clearer. Sophie's hands never touched Paige, yet she was the one penalized. It wasn't just a questionable call. It was the kind of mistake that changes the course of a game. The frustration wasn't limited to Indiana fans. Even neutral viewers watching the broadcast began flooding social media with clips of the shove, tagging the league's official accounts and demanding answers. Commentators struggled to find a diplomatic explanation. "I don't understand that call," one admitted live on air, while the other noted, "If that's a foul on Sophie, then I don't know what constitutes an offensive foul anymore." From that point on, the game's energy shifted. The Fever, who had been mounting a comeback, suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of another momentum-killing whistle. Instead of getting the ball back in a critical moment, they had to defend again while the Wings capitalized on free throws. It wasn't just about one play, it was about what it represented. The push call added to the growing suspicion that the officiating wasn't simply inconsistent, but actively leaning toward one team. And as bad as it was, the most jaw-dropping moment of the night hadn't even happened yet. Because soon after, the player at the center of Indiana's hopes, Aaliyah Boston, would be caught in a play so outrageous that fans still talk about it as one of the worst calls in league history. If the phantom push call had the Fever reeling, what happened to Aaliyah Boston moments later turned disbelief into outright outrage. It was the kind of play that makes you question whether the officials were even watching the same game as everyone else, or worse, whether they wanted a specific outcome. The sequence began, innocently enough. Boston was battling for position in the paint as the Fever prepared to defend an inbound pass. Guarding her was LaRue, a physical defender known for using her body to gain leverage. But this time, it wasn't just body positioning. It was something much more blatant. As the ball was about to be passed, and LaRue reached across and hooked her arm tightly around Boston's right arm. It wasn't a momentary tangle or incidental contact. It was a sustained hold, locking Boston's arm in place. She tried to free herself, but LaRue kept her grip, twisting her body to keep Boston trapped. From the sideline, it looked like a wrestling move and Boston was the one being restrained. Then came the most shocking part. Instead of letting go, LaRue yanked Boston's arm violently, pulling her shoulder forward in a way that made fans wince. It looked like an attempt to rip the ball free, or worse, dislocate her shoulder. Boston's face twisted in pain, but she still tried to play through it, pivoting to contest the pass. Everyone watching could see the foul. Everyone except the officials. The whistle finally blew, but when the referee turned and signaled, it was a foul on Boston. The crowd erupted in disbelief. You could see Boston's eyes widen, her hands thrown up in protest. The Fever bench was livid, players shouting toward the officials, and head coach Stephanie White could only shake her head in disgust. Replays made it even worse. From multiple angles, the footage clearly showed LaRue initiating and maintaining the arm lock, pulling Boston off balance and yanking her shoulder. Analysts on the broadcast didn't even try to hide their reactions. "That's an offensive foul." "Every single time," one said flatly. Another added, "I don't know how they missed that. It's not borderline, it's obvious." The impact on the game was immediate. Not only did Boston get tagged with the foul, but the officials also ruled it as an and one, giving Dallas both the basket and the free throw. What should have been a turnover in Indiana's favor turned into a 3-point swing for the Wings. For Fever fans, this wasn't just another bad call. This was the call, the one that broke their faith in the fairness of the game. And when whispers began to spread about additional camera angles the public hadn't seen yet, suspicion turned into something darker. Because if those angles told the same story everyone in the arena had witnessed, then the league had a much bigger problem on its hands than just one bad night of officiating. In the hours after the final buzzer, the outrage didn't fade, it grew. Fans weren't just upset about the officiating, they were convinced something deeper was at play. Social media was flooded with clips of the game, but one post in particular began to circulate with alarming speed. It claimed to show the angle they didn't want you to see, an alternate camera shot of the Aaliyah Boston armlock that was never shown on the live broadcast. The video, reportedly captured by a courtside fan, provided a crystal clear view of the incident. From this perspective, there was no room for debate. LaRue's arm wrapped around Boston's right arm like a clamp, her grip tightening as Boston tried to break free. You could see Boston's jersey stretch under the pressure, her shoulder jerking violently when LaRue pulled. The moment looked less like a basketball play and more like an intentional attempt to injure. And then came the part that made fans' jaws drop. The footage captured the referee's line of sight. The official was standing just a few feet away. Eyes locked directly on the two players. There was no obstruction, no crowding of bodies. The referee had a completely unobstructed view of the entire sequence. In other words, missing the call wasn't possible. The only explanation was that they saw it and chose not to call it correctly. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, fan forums. Hashtags like #FreeAaliyah and #WNBAFix began trending. Prominent sports personalities weighed in, some calling for the league to address the situation immediately. Others took it further, questioning the integrity of the game itself. "If this isn't cheating, I don't know what is," one analyst tweeted. Alongside the video, the leaked angle also revealed something subtle yet telling. Right after the whistle, LaRue glanced toward the referee with what many interpreted as a knowing smirk, as if she'd anticipated the call going in her favor. That single frame was screenshotted and shared thousands of times, becoming a symbol of the controversy. The league's silence only added fuel to the fire. While fans demanded an explanation, no official statement came from the WNBA or the officiating crew. Instead, the clip continued to rack up millions of views, with every share sparking more questions about how such an obvious foul could be ruled against the victim by the next morning. Sports talk shows were dedicating entire segments to the secret footage. Some former players called for referee suspensions. Others went as far as to suggest that the outcome of the game should be nullified. It had moved beyond a bad call. It was now a scandal threatening the credibility of the league. And if the WNBA thought the uproar would blow over, they were wrong. Because the moment that footage went public, it turned what could have been written off as human error into something far more dangerous. The perception that the game was rigged, and once that seed is planted, it's almost impossible to erase. If fans thought the secret footage was damning, the reality of what happened during the game was just as hard to stomach. The most baffling part wasn't that the officials made a bad call in real time. Mistakes happen in every sport. It was what they did after having the chance to fix it when the whistle blew on Aaliyah Boston. The Fever players immediately protested, surrounding the nearest referee and pointing to Boston's shoulder. Head coach Stephanie White motioned toward the scoreboard, demanding they review the play. The crowd roared in agreement, chanting for the refs to check the tape. In the WNBA, the officials have the authority to review certain types of fouls, and this situation fit the bill perfectly, and so they went to the monitor. For a moment, it felt like justice might prevail. The broadcast cut to a commercial break, and fans in the arena buzzed with anticipation. Everyone assumed the call would be overturned. After all, the replay clearly showed LaRue locking Boston's arm and pulling it across her body. When the officials returned from the review, they huddled briefly at midcourt. Then, the head referee turned toward the scorer's table, signaled the basket good, and confirmed the foul on Boston. The arena went from hopeful chatter to an explosion of disbelief. The Wings were awarded an +1, effectively giving them a 3-point swing in the game's most critical moment. Commentators were stunned. I can't believe they're standing by that call," one said, his voice trailing off. The other tried to explain the possible reasoning. Maybe they judged Boston for holding position too aggressively, but even she admitted it didn't line up with what was on the screen. "It's just hard to reconcile that with what we all saw," she added. By doubling down, the referees did more than impact the score. They sent a message, intentional or not, that no amount of evidence would change their minds. It was a moment that broke the unwritten trust between players and officials. The understanding that replay exists to get the call right, not to rubber stamp mistakes. On the Fever bench, you could see the emotional toll. Boston sat with her head down, visibly frustrated, while teammates tried to rally around her. The momentum Indiana had been building evaporated in an instant, replaced by a sense of inevitability. Dallas, smelling blood, capitalized immediately, pushing the lead back, up and forcing the Fever into desperation mode. For many fans, this was the point where suspicion hardened into certainty. A bad call can be forgiven. A bad call confirmed after review, with all the angles in front of you, feels like something else entirely. And as the game wound down, one thought kept echoing through the stands, across social media, and on every sports show that night. If this is how the league handles blatant evidence, what hope is there for fairness in the games to come? By the time the final buzzer sounded, the Fever's narrow loss had already taken a back seat to the brewing storm over the officiating. Fans weren't leaving the arena quietly. Many lingered in their seats, booing the refs as they walked off the floor, while others pulled out their phones, live streaming rants about the calls. The post-game atmosphere felt less like the aftermath of a basketball game and more like the scene of a political scandal. Social media exploded. The leaked secret footage of the Aaliyah Boston armlock was everywhere, accompanied by slow-motion breakdowns, freeze frames, and angry captions calling for accountability. Hashtags like #REFS exposed, #WNBA fix, and #Justice for Boston began. Trending within hours, popular sports commentators weighed in, some outright accusing the officiating crew of bias. Others were more measured but still critical, saying the optics of the game were damaging to the league's credibility. Even rival fan bases, who would normally revel in a Fever loss, chimed in to say the calls were unacceptable. This wasn't just about Indiana, it was about the integrity of the game itself. When your harshest critics start defending you, it's a sign the outrage has crossed team lines and entered the territory of league-wide concern. Players began reacting too. While no one directly accused the referees of cheating, several WNBA stars posted cryptic tweets about consistency in protecting players, clearly referencing the controversy. Some retweeted the fan shot footage without comment, letting the video speak for itself. A few former players were less subtle, openly saying that calls like these should cost refs their jobs. The league's silence made everything worse. The WNBA's official channels avoided mentioning the refereeing entirely in their game recap, focusing instead on player stats and highlight reels. That avoidance only inflamed suspicion that the league was trying to bury the story. Fans flooded the comments on every WNBA post, demanding an explanation and vowing not to attend games until officiating was addressed. Sports talk shows jumped on the story, turning it into a multi-day headline. Some hosts called for full transparency in referee evaluations, while others pushed for changes in the review process, arguing that if video evidence can't overturn obvious mistakes, then the system is broken. A few went even further, speculating that this could be the beginning of a larger investigation into officiating practices. For the Fever, the fallout was twofold. They not only had to swallow a gut-wrenching loss in a game they could have won, but they also had to deal with the emotional strain of feeling cheated on a national stage. The locker room was reportedly tense, with players and coaches trying to choose their words carefully to avoid league fines while still expressing their frustration. And for the league, the damage control phase was only beginning. The game had gone from a thrilling matchup to a PR crisis in less than 24 hours. And with each passing day, the pressure to respond grew heavier, because now it wasn't just about bad calls, it was about trust and whether the WNBA still had it. The Fever vs. Wings game was supposed to be remembered for its intensity and playoff implications. Instead, it's now cemented as one of the most controversial nights in recent WNBA history. From the early red flags in officiating to the phantom push call, and finally, the armlock on Aaliyah Boston, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The release of the secret footage didn't just expose a bad decision, it shattered the assumption that replay guarantees fairness. Fans are left wondering if what they witnessed was simple incompetence or something far worse. The league's refusal to address the situation head-on has only deepened suspicion, leaving a cloud over not just this game, but every game that follows. If the WNBA wants to protect its integrity, it can't let moments like this slide. Because, once trust is broken, earning it back is a battle that takes far longer than 4 quarters.